Kieran Voss woke up to the cold sting of metal against his back. His head throbbed, his body ached, and his wrists burned from the tight restraints. Slowly, his vision cleared, revealing the dim glow of a single red light flickering above him. A prison cell. Again. But this wasn't some rundown human jail. The walls were made of smooth black alloy, humming with an eerie energy. The air smelled sharp, almost metallic. Alien. Kieran tried to sit up, but his muscles screamed in protest. His last memory was of a Xalvaran patrol ship ambushing him in deep space. He had fought hard, maybe even taken one of them down. But in the end, the stun weapons had won. Now he was here, locked in a place he didn't recognize, surrounded by creatures he didn't trust. A low growl caught his attention. Across the cell block, an enormous alien with gray, leathery skin and 4 burning red eyes glared at him. Kieran had seen plenty of creatures in his time, but this one looked particularly nasty. It flexed its clawed fingers, lips pulling back to reveal sharp, black teeth. Great, first day here, and he already had an enemy. Footsteps echoed through the hallway. Heavy boots. Controlled, steady. A Xalvaran guard. Kieran had encountered Xalvarans before. Tall, powerful beings with violet skin and glowing markings that shimmered like stars. They were one of the most feared empires in the galaxy, known for their ruthless discipline and superior technology. This guard was different. She moved with precision, her deep purple armor polished and battle-worn. Her golden eyes scanned the prisoners with quiet authority, but there was something else in her gaze, something calculating. Her black hair, streaked with faint silver, was tied back, revealing the bioluminescent markings curling along her temples. She was beautiful, in a dangerous way. Kieran kept his expression neutral as she stopped in front of his cell. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was smooth but held no warmth. Kieran smirked. "Yeah, and I've had better wake-up calls." She didn't react. No anger, no amusement, just a blank, assessing stare. "You are human," she stated. "Last time I checked." The alien woman, Zaranvari, according to the insignia on her armor, tilted her head slightly. Her golden eyes studied him as if she were trying to understand something. Kieran had been in plenty of tough spots before, but this was different. The Xalvaran Empire didn't take prisoners unless they had a use for them, which meant they wanted something from him. Zara turned away, continuing her patrol. Kieran exhaled. That was close, but something told him this wouldn't be the last time she stopped at his cell. And he had a feeling she wasn't just another cold-hearted guard. She was curious about him. And in a place like this, curiosity could be dangerous. Kieran Voss sat on the cold floor of his cell, his back against the metallic wall. His wrists were still sore from the restraints, but he ignored the pain. Pain meant he was still alive. He had been in this prison for 2 days now, maybe 3. It was hard to tell without a window. And the dim red lights above never change. The food was barely edible, some kind of thick paste that tasted like burnt rubber. The air smelled stale, recycled. But Kieran refused to let it break him. Across from him, the gray-skinned alien with 4 red eyes, Vokar, as he had heard the guards call him, watched him closely. Vokar was massive, nearly 7 feet tall, with long arms and sharp claws. He had been staring at Kieran since he arrived, his expression unreadable. Kieran knew that look, a predator sizing up prey. The sound of boots echoed down the corridor. Zaranvari was back. Kieran watched as the Xalvaran guard moved down the hallway, inspecting each prisoner. The dim lighting made her violet skin glow faintly, her golden eyes sharp as they scanned the cells. Her armor was sleek, covering her body in protective plating, but her movements were graceful, controlled. When she reached his cell, she stopped. "Still alive?" she asked, arms crossed. Kieran smirked, disappointed. Zara's face remained unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes. "You are different from the others. I'll take that as a compliment." Before she could respond, a low growl came from across the corridor. Volker stood up, his massive frame blocking the light. His red eyes locked onto Kieran, and he stepped forward, gripping the bars of his cell. "He is weak," Volker said in a guttural voice. "I challenge him." Kieran sighed. "Really? We're doing this." Zyra turned to Volker. "Prisoners do not fight without authorization." Volker let out a deep, rumbling laugh. "Then I wait." His claws scraped against the bars. But soon, Zyra glanced back at Kieran. He could tell she was studying him, waiting to see how he would react. Kieran simply leaned back against the wall. "I'll be here." Zyra lingered for a second longer before turning and walking away. Kieran exhaled. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that humans didn't break so easily. Zara and Vari stood at the edge of the cell block, arms crossed, watching the human. Kieran Voss was different. Most prisoners in this facility either begged for mercy or cowered in silence, waiting for their fate. But not him. He was calm, confident, even when faced with death. He had no weapons, no allies, yet he acted as if he still had control. It irritated her and intrigued her. She had seen humans before, weak, fragile creatures who rarely lasted long in Solveran captivity. But this one, he was something else. Zara took a step closer to his cell. He was sitting on the floor, arms resting on his knees, staring at the ceiling as if he had nothing better to do. When he noticed her, he smirked. "Back again," Kieran said. "I must be more interesting than I thought." Zara ignored his words. "How did you survive the attack?" Kieran tilted his head. "Which attack?" "The patrol that captured you. Reports said you fought back. Injured 2 soldiers." Kieran shrugged. "They shot first." Zira narrowed her eyes. A single human should not have lasted more than a few seconds against trained Solveran warriors. Kieran leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "Maybe your warriors aren't as tough as you think." Zira's expression remained neutral, but inside, something flared. A challenge. "You're bold for a prisoner," she said. "You're curious for a guard," he countered. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Zyra felt something unfamiliar, an urge to ask more, to understand this human. But that was dangerous. She was a soldier, loyal to the Empire. This man was a prisoner, nothing more. And yet, Zyra turned away before she could let her thoughts wander further. As she walked down the corridor, she heard Kieran's voice behind her. "You'll be back," he said, amusement in his tone. Zyra didn't respond, but she knew he was right. And that unsettled her more than anything else. Zara and Vari knew she shouldn't return to the human cell. And yet, she found herself standing there again, arms crossed, watching Kieran Voss through the energy bars. It had been a week since his capture. Most prisoners by now would have broken, either by fear or by force. But Kieran remained unchanged. His body was bruised from his fight with Volker, but his spirit was untouched. Every time she looked at him, he had the same calm expression, the same sharp eyes that seemed to see right through her. Tonight, he was sitting against the wall, absent-mindedly tossing a small metal bolt into the air and catching it. When he saw her, he grinned. "You must really like me," Kieran said. Zira ignored the comment. "You're reckless." He caught the bolt again, tilting his head. "Why?" "Because I didn't roll over and cry like the rest of your prisoners." "No." Zyra's golden eyes studied him. "Because you refuse to accept your place." Kieran smirked. "And what place is that?" "A prisoner," she said. "Alone. Without power." Kieran chuckled. "If that's what you think, you don't understand humans at all." Zyra stiffened. There it was again. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, it was different from everything she had been taught about his species. Humans were supposed to be weak. They were supposed to fear the Solveran. But Kieran wasn't afraid. Not of her, not of the guards, not of the Empire itself. She found herself gripping the bars of his cell without realizing it. "Why are you like this?" she asked. Kieran leaned forward, his voice low but firm. Because I've been through worse than this, and because no matter where you put me, no matter how many chains you wrap around me, I will never stop being who I am. Zira's breath hitched for just a moment. She had trained for war her entire life. She had fought in battles, crushed rebellions, brought entire species to their knees. And yet, this single human in a cage had shaken something inside her. It was dangerous. "Get some rest," she said quickly, stepping away from the cell. But as she walked down the corridor, she knew the truth. She would return. Because for the first time in her life, she had met someone who made her question everything. And that terrified her more than anything else. Kieran Voss had seen many terrible things in his life. War, betrayal, the destruction of entire colonies. But what he saw today inside the Xalvaran prison would stay with him forever. The screams had started at dawn. Kieran had been resting against the wall of his cell when the alarms blared. The heavy steel doors of the prison groaned open, and a group of guards dragged in a new prisoner, a frail, blue-skinned alien with wide, terrified eyes. The guards tossed the prisoner into a cell nearby, but Kieran barely had time to register the newcomer before another set of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Commander Vekar. Kieran had seen the Xalvaran officer once before. Tall and broad-shouldered, with deep violet skin and cold silver eyes, Vekar was everything Kieran expected from an Imperial enforcer. Ruthless, cruel, and completely loyal to the Empire. Vekar stopped in front of the new prisoner's cell, his expression unreadable. "You were caught outside the restricted zone," he said in a slow, measured voice. The blue-skinned alien, barely able to stand, shook their head. Please, I was only trying to find food." Vekar's face remained blank. Without a word, he raised his arm and pressed a button on his wrist device. The cell floor beneath the prisoner glowed red. The alien gasped in horror before collapsing, convulsing in pain as electric currents surged through their body. The air filled with the scent of burning flesh. Kieran shot to his feet, his hands clenched into fists. "That's enough." His voice rang out in the silence, sharp and defiant. Vekar turned slowly, his silver eyes locking onto Kieran. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Ah, the human speaks," he said. "How amusing." Kieran's jaw tightened. They were just looking for food. Vekar stepped closer to Kieran's cell, tilting his head. "And the Empire does not tolerate trespassers." Kieran's muscles tensed with rage. "You call this justice?" Vekar chuckled. "Justice? No, this is order." He glanced at the suffering prisoner and pressed the button again. The cell floor dimmed, and the alien's shaking stopped. Their breathing was shallow, their body motionless. Zira Anvari had been standing silently at the edge of the corridor. Now she stepped forward, her golden eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Commander," she said carefully, "the prisoner has learned their lesson." Vekar gave her a sideways glance. "Do you disapprove, Lieutenant Navari?" Zira's fingers twitched at her sides. For the first time, Kieran saw hesitation in her expression, a crack in the armor. She hesitated. Then she lowered her gaze. "No, sir." Vekar smirked. "Good." He turned back to Kieran. "You should learn from her, human. Obedience is the only path to survival." Without another word, Vekar strode away, the guards following behind him. The blue-skinned prisoner lay still, barely breathing. Kieran exhaled sharply, anger burning in his chest. He turned his gaze toward Zira, who was still standing there, motionless. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without looking at him, Zira turned and walked away. But Kieran knew. He had seen the look in her eyes. Doubt. And doubt was dangerous in the Xalvaran Empire. Zira Anvari couldn't sleep. She sat in her quarters, staring at the polished surface of her armor resting on the table. The soft glow of the control panels on the walls cast long shadows across the room, but she barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere. The human had seen it. The moment of hesitation. the flicker of doubt. Karen Voss had looked at her like he knew exactly what she was thinking, and that terrified her. For years, Zyra had believed in the Empire's strength. The Xalveran were superior, destined to rule. Order was necessary, and those who defied it had to be punished. That was what she had been taught since childhood. But today, she had watched a helpless creature suffer under Commander Vekar's command, all for something as simple as food. She had seen the way Karen had stood up, unafraid, even though he was powerless. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure who was right. A sharp beep from her door interrupted her thoughts. Zyra straightened. Enter. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, and Karen Voss stepped inside. She tensed. How did you? He held up a small device, one of the guards' stolen keycards. Turns out, your guards aren't as observant as they think. Zyra immediately reached for the weapon at her hip, but Karen didn't move. He just stood there, watching her with that same unreadable expression. If you were going to kill me, you would have done it already, he said. Zyra hesitated. He was right. Why are you here? She demanded. Karen took a step closer. Because I see it in your eyes. Zyra narrowed her gaze. See what? Doubt. She stiffened, but Karen didn't stop. You know this isn't right, he said. You saw what happened today. You felt it. Zyra clenched her fists. It doesn't matter what I feel. Karen took another step, voice lower now. Then why didn't you stop him? Zyra's breathing was steady, controlled. But inside, something cracked. She had asked herself the same question over and over again. Why didn't she stop it? Because she was afraid. Not of Vekar, not of punishment. She was afraid of the truth. The truth that maybe, just maybe, the empire she had served all her life was not as righteous as she had believed. Karen was watching her closely, waiting. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just trying to save himself. He was testing her. Finally, she spoke. There is no escaping this place, she said. Even if you run, the Empire will hunt you. Karen smirked. Then I guess I'll have to be smarter than the Empire. Zyra shook her head. You are reckless. And you, Karen said, stepping even closer, are better than this. Silence. Zyra knew what was happening. This was the moment. She could turn him in, prove her loyalty to the Empire. Or she could make a choice. A dangerous choice. Finally, she exhaled and reached for the controls on her wrist. The cell alarms would be disabled for exactly 3 minutes. She looked at him. You have until then. Karen's grin widened. I knew you liked me. Zyra rolled her eyes. Move before I change my mind. Karen didn't hesitate. He slipped out of the door, silent as a shadow. Zyra stood there, her heart pounding. There was no turning back now. She had just betrayed the Empire. And for the first time, she didn't regret it. Karen Voss moved swiftly through the dimly lit corridors of the prison. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic would get him caught. The stolen keycard in his hand buzzed softly as he used it to bypass another security door. Zyra had given him exactly 3 minutes before the alarms reactivated. 3 minutes to disappear. He wasn't going to waste them. The facility was massive. A maze of steel hallways and reinforced doors. He had studied the guards' movements for days, memorized every patrol route. But even with all his planning, this was a risk. And he wasn't alone. Across the corridor, in the shadows, Zyra Anvari watched him from a distance. She had done the unthinkable, helped a human prisoner escape. The weight of her choice pressed down on her, but there was no time for regret. If Karen was caught, it wouldn't just be his life at stake. Hers would be too. She tapped the control panel on her wrist, accessing the facility's internal systems. A quick override disabled a section of surveillance cameras. It wouldn't go unnoticed for long, but it was enough. Karen reached a junction and glanced back at her. Which way? He whispered. Zyra hesitated. She shouldn't be doing this, but she was already too deep. She pointed. Left. Maintenance tunnels. Karen nodded and slipped into the next passageway. The air here was thick with the scent of oil and metal. Pipes hissed with steam, and flickering lights barely illuminated the narrow path. It was clear that Xalvarin didn't expect prisoners to make it this far. Perfect. Zira followed, her boots making no sound. "You'll need to move fast," she murmured. "Once they notice." A distant alarm blared. Too late. Karen cursed under his breath. Zira checked her wrist display. Security teams were already mobilizing. "We're out of time," she said. Karen grinned. "Then we better run." They moved quickly, slipping between machinery and rusted metal beams. Zira led the way, her sharp senses guiding them through the labyrinth of tunnels. Karen kept up, his movements quick and precise. But the Empire wouldn't let them go so easily. A metallic voice echoed through the corridors. "Alert! Prisoner escape detected. Lockdown initiated." The doors ahead slammed shut. Red warning lights flashed. Karen skidded to a stop. "Well, that's not good." Zira checked the control panel beside the door. "They've sealed the exits." Karen glanced over his shoulder. "And I'm guessing we don't have time to hack it." Zira shook her head. "No." Heavy footsteps thundered in the distance. The guards were coming. Karen clenched his jaw. He had come too far to be captured now. Zira's mind raced. There was one last option, but it was insane. "The waste chute," she said. Karen blinked. "You want me to escape through garbage? Do you want to get shot?" Karen sighed. "Fair point." Zira pried open a side panel, revealing a narrow metal chute leading downward. The smell was awful, but it was their only chance. Karen peered inside. "Where does it go?" Zira hesitated. "It empties into the lower docks. If you're lucky, you can find a transport ship before security locks it down." Karen gave her a look. "And if I'm not lucky?" Zira didn't answer. Karen smirked. "I'll take my chances." He gripped the edges of the chute and turned back to her. "Come with me." Zira froze. She had never considered it. Leaving everything behind. Her rank, her duty, her entire life. But before she could respond, the guards rounded the corner. "Karen, go," she ordered. For once, he didn't argue. He flashed her one last grin and disappeared down the chute. Zira turned to face the approaching guards. For better or worse, she had made her choice. And now, she had to deal with the consequences. Karen Voss tumbled out of the waste chute and landed hard on the cold metal floor. The air smelled of oil and damp steel, but at least it wasn't full of garbage. He groaned and pushed himself up. He was in a lower docking bay, a massive underground hangar where transport ships loaded supplies for the Xalvarin fleet. This was his chance. Blending into the shadows, Karen moved quickly. The docking bay was mostly empty, but a few guards patrolled the area. He had to be careful. In the distance, he spotted a small cargo ship, its engines powered down, waiting for departure. Perfect. Karen moved toward it, sticking to the blind spots of security cameras. He reached the ship's loading ramp, but just as he was about to step inside, a sharp voice cut through the silence. "Don't move." Karen froze. Slowly, he turned to see a Xalvarin guard standing behind him, weapon raised. The guard sneered. "You really thought you could escape?" Karen clenched his jaw. He had no weapon, no cover. He was out of options. But before the guard could fire, a sharp crack rang through the air. The guard's body went stiff. His weapon slipped from his grasp as he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Karen blinked. Then he saw her. Zira stood behind the fallen guard, her stunned bacon crackling with energy. Karen grinned. "You just can't stay away, can you?" Zira rolled her eyes. "Get on the ship." He didn't need to be told twice. They rushed inside, sealing the ramp behind them. Zira moved to the controls, her fingers flying across the console. The ship's engines rumbled to life. Outside, alarms blared. "They know," Kieran said. Zira's expression was calm, focused. "Then we leave now." The docking bay doors began to close. Armed guards poured into the hangar, weapons raised. Kieran strapped himself in as Zira gripped the controls. "Hold on." The ship's thrusters roared, and in a split second, they launched forward. Blaster fire erupted behind them, but Zira was fast. She weaved the ship through the closing doors, metal scraping against metal as they barely made it through. Then they were free. The dark void of space stretched before them, endless and open. Kieran exhaled, a slow grin spreading across his face. "I can't believe you actually came." Zira kept her eyes on the controls. "Neither can I." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the stars glowing outside the cockpit. Then Kieran turned to her. "So, what now?" Zira hesitated. She had spent her entire life serving the Empire, believing in its power. Now she was a fugitive, a traitor. But for the first time, she felt free. She glanced at Kieran, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Now, we disappear." Kieran chuckled. "I like the sound of that." With a final push of the controls, the ship shot into hyperspace, leaving the Empire behind. Neither of them knew what lay ahead, but for the first time, they were in control of their own fate.